emergency for the first time in about...
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 1231.PS9203, certificate number 36611. Stradivarius Violins.
And other instruments.
So did Stradivarius make other things like cellos and trumpets? And
He did. It's believed that he made about 1,100 instruments during his long life. Antonio Stradivari from Lombardy, Italy, 1644 to 1737. He, of his 1,100 instruments, over 500 violins survive, 63 cellos, 13 violas, 5 guitars.
Okay.
Imagine like if you're 5 guitars and they were all played by the Traveling Wilburys on their first record. They were all playing. I wonder what a Stradivarius guitar sounds like.
Well, yeah, and I'm sure. Can you imagine sitting with a Stradivarius guitar and going dun 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 dun? It just seems like you couldn't resist doing it.
It would still sound like medieval somehow. Plink, plink, plink.
Yeah.
2 mandolins and a harp.
You're kidding.
There is one Stradivarius harp sitting in a music conservatory in Naples.
But a harp, I was joking when I said trumpet because a harp would have a metal working component.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe not. Do you think?
He just made a wood harp? Yeah, I guess, sure.
Because everything else here, clearly he's going to use the same woodworking skills.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you can make a wood harp. Of course you can.
I don't know. He invented the guitar. Several harmonicas survive.
Started the Roland Corporation.
I mean, speaking of guitars, we've done shows about guitar fetishism of various kinds.
Yes.
What do we do? Do we the Stratocaster?
We did the 59 Les Paul.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we talked about all kinds of electric guitar wizardry and gadgetry.
Yeah, I mentioned some gadgetry the other day, and I saw the...
Now we're getting pictures of pedal boards sent to us.
I know.
Previously previously you would annoy others with pictures of pedal boards. Now it's a free trade economy.
But the FutureLink sites exploded with all these FutureLinks that were like, look at my pedal board, annoying the other FutureLinks who just can't stand that stuff.
But I just realized, I don't know if I know, or maybe I just don't remember this answer. So as a rock guitarist,
yes.
Riddle me this. When guitarists talk about the guitar they love or the guitar they fetishize or whatever that is, are they talking more about how it feels to play or more about the sound, the tone?
Both things. I mean, there's
what gets privileged?
Well, because guitarists are such nerds, they will talk about all of that, and it's all justification, first of all, to buy a new guitar, which is what every guitarist really wants. But there is the conventional wisdom is that guitars that have been played sound much better than guitars that haven't, because the resonance in the wood creates a certain
the more you play. This is part of the discussion we will have today.
And so there's actually now a device that you can, like a battery-powered device, you can attach to an acoustic guitar that sits and hums.
Oh, it doesn't pluck. It just makes the resonance that is similar to the strings.
And that if you leave it on your acoustic guitar, by all reports...
It's like you're plugging your guitar in one of those paint shaker machines.
Yeah.
That they have at Home Depot.
By all reports, you plug it in and in a very short amount of time, this resonator machine
Is it like
transforms the sound of your acoustic guitar.
Is it like a shoe where you want it to get broken in and then it's fine, or will it change over the decades?
Yeah, I think it changes over the decades because, of course, the varnish changes, the wood changes just as part of its nature. But yeah, that playing it, I mean, leaving it and not playing it, it will change. But playing it causes it to change in a melodious way.
But what do you love about a guitar? Is it like, oh, I just love how this feels in my hands, the feel is perfect? Or is it really like, this thing's hard to play, but it sounds so great?
I mean, there are both things, right? There are guitars that where the neck has warped to the point that it's extremely hard to play. But if you play it with a slide, it sounds incredible because although you can't fret the strings, it's too far away. With a slide now, you've got access to all the tone of the body. I had the experience. We were on tour, and the bass player, I was in Harvey Danger at the time. The bass player of Harvey Danger had recently bought a new Martin guitar, and we all played it and felt like,
is that nice? I don't know. Should it be a high-end guitar?
Yeah, it was not a high-end Martin, but it was a Martin, and it should have played well and sounded good. But none of us bonded with it. And the guitar went in the bottom of the bus, in its case, just put in the bus and just left there. And we drove all the way across the country with the bus going for hours at a time.
Maybe keep going. Like, give us a sense of that, the whole length of the tour.
And at the end of the tour, we pulled the guitar out of the bottom, and somehow, I mean, and a lot of this might just be wishful thinking, but I don't think so. Somehow we pulled that guitar out of the case, and it played amazing and sounded incredible. Just having spent a couple of months riding under the bus, and all we could attribute it to was vibration, and it just somehow seasoned itself down there. Now that would be expensive if you were a guitar person who was like, I want to transform my guitar. Like, oh, put it in the bottom of a tour bus if you're lucky enough.
Well, you don't have to buy a bus just for this. You could just send it on a series of Greyhound adventures.
There you go. That's right. But maybe the rock vibe of us up above, like just being rock stars, maybe that went down.
Well, this is a show quite a bit about vibes because it's hard to say. There is something indefinable about music and tone and instruments, the physicality of an instrument that sometimes seems to defy or at least not care that much about science.
Electric guitars, there's for sure so much of this mystical.
Yeah.
Whether or not this pickup was wound by this particular person and the profile of the neck, two necks that are indistinguishable from one another, but one of them sits in the hand.
Well, Satan has a lot of domain over electric guitars.
Yes,
so
Satan does.
You can see how his will would kind of mysteriously and arcanely lead to supernatural effects you wouldn't expect.
Exactamundo. And what's been very weird in the last decade is that the technology of making guitars has improved to the point that a lot of guitars, I mean, we used to think of Japanese guitars as cheapo, and now they're prized. Mm-hmm. But
the same ones? No.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Because they've seasoned over time. And it turns out we thought they were cheap, but they were made by these master craftsmen.
They were great guitars in embryo.
But now you can buy a guitar that's made in Korea, and it looks like a $30,000 guitar. And it costs $350, and it arrives and it plays great. And although it sounds meh, you plug it into some boxes, turn up your digital this and that.
By plays great, you mean the feel, just the feel to the guitarist
feels great. It looks great. And you make a few electronic modifications and it sounds great. And it's so frustrating for those of us who grew up at a time when it was like, well, if you are a serious musician, you're going to have this guitar. And if you have this guitar, you're not a serious musician. And now it's just like, if I was a 15-year-old, I would buy a $350 guitar and be just as good as 80% of the classic guitars. It's very frustrating.
Well, these dynamics also happen in the world of classical music.
Oh, for sure.
They're just less interesting because they're happening in the world
Yeah.
of music no one listens
There's
to.
zero sex.
So let's move away from rock and Satan and sex and Alice Cooper and all the things you want to hear a podcast about, and let's move into the world of classical strings.
Now, wait a minute. I'm going to ask you a question that I know you're going to be the expert on, but I bet you in the classical world, there's a lot of sex. I bet you they're sexing each other all the time.
I would assume so.
Because somebody's like,
oh, you think there's something particular about classical music that leads to?
Well, and because they're sequestered and they're all nerds, it's just like
that's
camp
what I
counselors,
think.
right?
I mean, there is the whole Randy harpsichord music where like, ooh, I'm going to associate this with frolicking Viennese young people getting under each other's skirts. But I think it's much more what you're saying, that there's always this Olympic Village quality when you get young, obsessed people together.
I think
Who
that's
knows
what it
what's
is.
going on in symphonies?
Yeah, I bet you that they're doing it in the broom closets all around the world.
A friend of mine, his sister sadly died of cancer, but it turned out she had this finished novel on her computer. She had previously published a novel, and she has there's a new novel out posthumously called The Fetishist and it's set in the world of classical music performance, and it's about largely white guys in that world fixating on their Asian co-musicians, possibly to a problematic degree. And it really made me think about these issues like, oh yeah, like an orchestra must just be like it's like a co-ed volleyball team.
Sure, it's like timpani players are all like rolling up on viola players.
If you play in an orchestra, please tell us what the least and most horny sections of the orchestra are.
I definitely want to know.
Because I have no idea. Like if you told me, man, oboists are freaks, I'd be like, yeah.
I bet you flautists are like super horny.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like, what about the instruments? I guess in movies, a cello often conveys sexiness because it's often an attractive woman, at least in the movie, and it's the only instrument you put between your legs, right?
Right.
It's the size of a human, and you're putting you're putting the bulge of it between your legs. It writes itself.
Well, I had a stand-up bass in my apartment at one point. I was living in a loft, and we used to find pianos just kind of sitting on the street. This was at the time when people were like, well, nobody plays piano anymore. Let's just wheel this out to the sidewalk. And we would wheel pianos home all the time. And we had a freight elevator. And so we had pianos. And then somebody brought a bass, and nobody played it. It just sat in the corner. And so I started to go learn it and just sit when nobody was in the place and thump away at it.
You can plunk, yeah.
And it's extremely sexy because it's the size of a person. It's the size of a big person.
Plus it's got the low vibrations.
It does. And you embrace it. You literally hug it to play it. And I got into this relationship with this bass where
I don't want to know anymore.
No, but you're really dancing with it. As you play it, you and the instrument are moving around, and it's very sympathetic with you. I really, ever since I've felt like, why don't I own a bass? You can buy them. They're for sale places.
Yeah, bring those vibes, bring those sexy bass vibes into your living room.
Really,
why not?
They take up a lot of room. But you're right, and
I have a friend who's a bass player, and that's what he says. Like you can't have a room full of basses the way a guitar nerd or a violin nerd would.
It's kind of like pianos. It's very hard to have a room full of pianos unless you live in a big industrial space. But Dr. Dre said about the cello that it's the evilest sounding of all instruments.
Did he mean that in like a good way?
Yeah. He said he puts cello on his tracks when he really wants to up the like dark street vibe, which you would not think.
No.
Dark street vibe.
Very, very few drive-by shootings in real life are accompanied. Very little gang violence actually accompanied by cello music.
But if you listen to Dr. Dre, it turns out that's not true because there's all kinds of that energy.
It's thumping in the radio, and
in the radio.
You don't even realize. You mentioned the cost of one of these fancy guitars. Tens of thousands of dollars. I'm sure the high end. Dude, what did Kurt Cobain's guitar just go for? There was a big auction, right? It just went for millions?
Yeah. All the big guitars are going for millions, but I think it's because it's just like classic cars, right? It's boomers and now early Gen X who have the money and they grew up in a guitar time.
Yeah.
I think 20 years from now, all these people that have $10 million guitars are going to find that absolutely no later millennials.
Yeah, you bought it at the peak of Kurt Cobain nostalgia.
Yeah, and no person that was born in 1989 cares at all, probably, right? Because their primary instruments were turntables and mixing boards, right? They're going to pay all that money.
They're going to want an old Roland.
Yeah, right. And that's great for me because I have a stack of the old Rolands. But
people are now sending us drum machine pictures. Stop.
I know.
Do not hit send. My eyes won't even see it.
I want to see your 808.
So, and a lot of that might just be, if this is analogous to what's going on in the violin world, the real problem with prices happened when people started to, as always happens, when people started to consider them as a financial instrument.
Right.
Like, what if it wasn't just musicians and collectors who were interested in Stradivariuses, or antique maps, or cars, or any number of, paintings?
Yeah.
What if you're dealing
paintings, geez.
What if you're dealing with a population 10 times bigger that it just has dollar signs ka-chinging in their eyes?
I can't believe there are
investor culture.
500 Stradivarius violins that are known.
Yeah, it's a big number. Like, that means like over half of his violins survived, and they survived 300 years. But what do people take better care of than a family-owned musical instrument? It's something you're always kind of tweaking and worried about condition and cracking.
Is this one of those things? Have I read that they're kind of like Rembrandts? They're hard to actually identify as a Stradivarius. People are like, "This is a Stradivarius." And it's like, well, maybe
it's infamous for that, but for an extremely dumb reason. I guess for years after, Stradivarius died in 1737, but with such a great reputation that for centuries thereafter, people making violins, whether they were in Manchester or Milan or Davenport, Iowa, would often put like a Stradivarius like label or tag in there in the violin. So the maker's mark appears to be like, it says in Italian, from the Cremonese workshop of Antonio Stradivari. And this was just kind of understood as
they'd sell them in Kansas City.
Yeah, it's a nod to the traditions of look at this amazing Stradivarius-like instrument our factory can produce. And what that means is every 6 hours, somebody goes into their attic, finds grandma's violin, and is amazed that it's a Stradivarius, and immediately calls the Smithsonian or something, or Antiques Roadshow. And so the Smithsonian actually has a page on its website saying, by the way, there's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of violins that say from the Cremonese workshop of Antonio Stradivari that are not of that period or workmanship. These are likely crap. But of the ones that do exist, like, we know what the high end is. I mean, this number is now over a decade old. But in 2011, probably the second best preserved Stradivari violin sold at auction for almost $16 million.
Whoa.
And, it was kind of seen as a one-of-a-kind thing. It had been 15 years since a single golden period. Stradivari produced his best, kind of most innovative and lasting designs from 1700 to 1725. They had longer proportions, a lighter varnish. It's really kind of generally accepted as his highest quality work. And it had been 15 years since a single one had come up at auction. And this one was better preserved than I think any other Stradivarius in the world, except for the one in the Ashmolean Library at Oxford. They all have names, by the way.
Oh, they're like the Antonio Giannafieri.
Yeah, it's a past owner, or it's the castle where it was long held, or
jewels.
So they all have individual names like diamonds, yes. And I think this might be the Messiah. I don't know, but this is the one Oxford has. They believe it has never been played.
What?
There's a Stradivarius sitting in a case that's never been played. So it's like the.
So now they really won't play it.
Imagine a heist movie where Nicolas Cage just wants to break in and be the first person ever to play the. Or he wants the harp.
Just play it and then put it back in the case.
He's like, nah, and he puts it back in.
Dun, dun, dun.
I would want to do a heist for the harp. There's one Stradivarius harp. I'm fascinated now by this harp.
Right.
Like, that's like the stealing the Declaration of Independence.
But the harp market is small.
I would assume so.
I have a friend who has a harp, his grandmother's harp. And he's like, he actually wrote me, he was like, do you want this harp?
They're so big.
And I was like, yeah, I do, but I don't know if I have a place for a harp. I do want it though.
I have a harpist friend, and then another friend who's like whose ex was a harpist, and I guess they're just enormous. They're unwieldy. You have to. Yeah. How do you even get them in the trunk of anything to get to the venue? So that's kind of the high end. These things will go for $16 million in an age where there's an investor class that's like, I'm going to put my money in a Stradivarius. And a lot of that is because of this mystique they have that reaches beyond the music world to the point where, the average person like knows that this is a special, something numinous and magical about this particular violin maker.
It would seem that we're at a time where classical music is really not the cultural force it was even 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Like that Stradivari.
There are Stradivarius ways to pluralize it.
I'm going to stop that. Why would they retain? I mean, I guess there's no use for a Rembrandt either, but it's interesting that they continue to be an investment property even as fewer and fewer people are using them.
It seems to be they're not making any more problem.
Yeah.
And, I feel like the classical music world is holding up well just in terms of like music education.
Yeah.
Like we're probably at an all-time high point of like your kid won't get into the right college or won't have the right brain cells develop unless they do this specific kind of violin training from the age of blank,
Yeah.
So that kind of thinking is still huge, and that will produce a music playing class.
Right.
And, some
Music
audience.
appreciating class.
Yeah, and some audience for an evening of Mahler or whatever.
I don't think that's compatible with Marxism. I think that we're just creating a new ruling class that has ever heard of violin.
That knows the Suzuki method.
That can write in cursive and knows the Suzuki method.
I watched the Oscar-nominated short subjects from last year, and the one that ended up winning, and I was convinced that it was going to win because it was, to me, far and away the best one, is about, I guess the LA school district still issues free instruments to anybody who wants one. All the orchestras and bands in the city of LA, your kid does not have to pay for their trombone or their viola.
That's pretty
or whatever.
rad.
It's amazing, speaking of compatibility with Marxism, but it means, guess who's not easy on instruments? Like all these things are old,
teens.
Terrible shape. They've been cared for only by teens sticking chewing gum in the F holes. And by the way, if you're a teen, don't stick chewing gum in your F hole.
No, it changes everything about your life.
It'll ruin your life. So it kind of follows the craftsman. There's still a dedicated repair facility where
it's for the LA schools.
Yeah, where school district employees are in charge of every trumpet that comes through.
It's like a shop.
It's very much a shop, and they all have their own little story of how they got there that are cleverly narrated to mirror the journeys of the instruments over the years.
How rad!
It's a great documentary, but it does make you think. Yeah, classical music is actually not dead just because kids will always play in bands and orchestras.
Yeah, I see. Right.
But like, do you remember? I guess. Well, before I do this, let's talk about Stradivari himself. The entry's not about him, which is good because we don't really know much about him.
He's like Shakespeare. He's maybe Francis Bacon made these Stradivariuses.
Well, the main thing people know about him is that Cremona was the center of great violin work, and he was an apprentice of the great Amati family that produced all the great violins. Like this is what you see about Stradivarius in crossword clues, like it's the one thing people know about him, and I guess it's now believed maybe not to be true.
Right.
Like his work actually has more in common with there's another guy called Guarneri, another great Cremonese violin house that his work has more in common with. Huh. So now scholars are like, yeah, that one violin that says he's a apprentice to the Amatis might be bogus. But anyway, this part of northern Italy at this time of the world was the capital of the violin industry. And at a very young age, in his 20s, it appears that Stradivari begins his own shop. And when, a decade or two later, the great Niccolò Amati dies, the great violin guy, there is a hole in the market.
Uh-huh.
And Stradivari immediately sticks his chewing gum into that hole. Like he becomes the big name very, very young. Because again, he's been making these things. He's had his own shop since he was like 21. And suddenly he has an international reputation. The Medicis are buying his violins.
That's how they get you.
But like King James II of England also owns a Stradivarius. Like it's well known that this is the part of Europe where the good instruments come from.
And he somehow in his 20s became the guy.
He's the guy, yeah. From once the Amati genius guy dies, he kind of becomes the inheritor of that local legacy.
Is there a secret? Does he have some secret? I mean, Cremona is in the middle of nowhere in Italy. Like, it can't be further from, I mean, I guess it's between Rome and
So you're
Milan,
saying that's a likely place where somebody could come up with an amazing bit of violin tech.
Well, they're not distracted by whaling ships. There's nobody dancing there.
But also they're not on some kind of Silk Road like nexus of ideas where, travelers from the East taught Stradivari the secrets of, well, this is kind of the thing that I'm most interested in about Stradivarius's instruments, is this idea that there's a secret. Because what's the amazing thing about him is, like, he was successful in his lifetime. You know, he built his violins probably in a loft above his residence. We know where it was. He had two sons, Francesco and Omobeno, who worked for him, but were not that great. Francesco produced lousy violins, we can now see, and Omobeno's were Omobono? His name was Omobono?
Omobono.
Why was his son a gorilla in the Cincinnati Zoo?
Omobono, he's like, am I bugging you, mister? I don't mean to bug you.
That's Omobono. Omobono sounds like something Tarzan says to summon his jungle friends. Or whatever.
He might, he was probably born in Africa, if you know what I mean.
Tarzan?
No, he became the president of the United States.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, President Omobono.
Yeah, Omobono.
We all voted for him twice. He was so.
So, do we know anything about his sons? It seems like trying to figure out something about him.
Well, they didn't really continue the line. That's what I'm saying. There was not a Stradivari workshop that continued for generations to come with family members. But along with, he was rich and famous by the time he died with a Europe-wide reputation. But the funny thing is, like with Amati, the violins of that era are kind of universally regarded as the peak of the craft, and therefore the model for all other violins from then till now. Basically, the next 300 plus years, people have just been making violins in the manner of his craft. And I can't think of another area of human endeavor or technology where things just peaked 300 years ago and we just decided, yep, this is as good as it gets. We're just going to, like, I'm sure if you look at a comb from back then in a museum, it would be a piece of crap. It would be brittle ivory. Like, compared to the dollar store comb today, it wouldn't have the cool thing where some of them are closer spaced or whatever. Like, no matter what your household device, there have been advances in 300 years. Well, and that does not appear to be true of even something as intricate and complicated as the violin.
Were there like a multitude of violin designs and concepts that all went away like heritage apples? Is a Stradivarius some kind of aperture and most violin concepts didn't make it through?
That's part of it. But the fact is that if like heirloom apples, some of those concepts really did produce more delicious violins, you'd think that somebody, whether in Europe, America, or Japan, would have tried that out. And there's a general idea, not just that this is the right way to make a violin, but in fact, that there's something, as you say, mysterious or even lost about the degree of skill that he brought to his work.
We're not 300 years away from the electric guitar being invented, but we've all noticed, and I think I talked about in my show, that Leo Fender invented the Telecaster, and basically guitar was done. Anybody today could play a Telecaster, and it would be just as good as any other guitar, and all other guitar manufacturers kind of either imitating the Telecaster or the Les Paul.
And you think that's true in centuries, if electric guitars still exist? They will more or less be...
It's one of these crazy things where he tried a thing, and the first time he did it, he made an iconographical... That's not a word.
No, that's totally the word.
He made like the perfect, instrument, and despite every other attempt to advance the thing, we still have a bridge of a certain kind, two pickups, a couple of knobs, and a switch.
The fact that doesn't happen in any other area of human accomplishment makes me think there's something specific about music. that maybe it's something about the way the craft gets passed down from teachers to learners, that you don't really want somebody to be like, here's a bold new take on the violin, because you have an audience whose ears have been trained by the old ones, and teachers who have learned to teach on the old ones, and students who are used to the old ones. So maybe those things, music does tend to flatten because it values tradition and legacy.
Maybe. I mean, I wonder, like, I don't think the hoe that we use, and I know you're famous for your hoe references, but I feel, oh, you just sneered at me.
Just because it's on YouTube doesn't mean it wasn't like 6 seconds of my life. I don't.
It'll be your third line in your Wikipedia entry after you're gone.
As a person, I have no time for hoes.
But I don't think the design of the hoe has probably changed very much over time.
You think the hoe is perfect in Mesopotamia?
Or like a stirrup? Like how different is a stirrup?
It'll be nicer stuff though. Like it'll be like,
yeah.
I'm so glad this is stainless steel now and not like there's titanium in here, not like what my grandma had.
Yeah, that's right.
I just feel like in most cases.
Well, and in the case of instruments,
machine,
like the wood that's used in those early guitars doesn't exist anymore. That's part of the mystique, right? That, we chopped down all the forests, and so there are no more.
And do you believe this kind of mystique? Because when people talk about the Stradivarius, you hear them say things like, you can't duplicate this sound. It's rich, it's refined, or it's sweet. It's often said to be bright or brilliant. It's compared to a woman's voice singing. And it reminds me of nothing more than audiophiles talking about this ineffable warmth of vinyl,
right,
that no subsequent tech can compete with, and probably just as spurious, no offense to vinyl nerds.
I mean, what's funny is that nothing has been studied more than the Stradivarius, probably, in terms of how do we make a thing that sounds like this. And so every expert in varnish, wood, carving, every aspect of it has studied it to the minutest detail and has probably successfully duplicated it, right? It's not like, all this varnish stuff. It's like, those cockroaches don't exist anymore. And it's like, don't they? I mean, surely there's a jar of it that somebody has successfully, and yet, like a Telecaster, they've taken those apart down to the molecule. And all that stuff is available. You could go on eBay right now and buy every part that claims to be a perfect reproduction, put them together, and the guitar's worth $1,200.
Well, that's what I think about when people talk about an ineffable sonic quality. I'm always like, well, we could look at the waveform of what you're hearing. And I'm sure whatever you are interpreting as warmth on this crappy old record, like I'm sure we could get a digital waveform to duplicate.
It's like a California wine.
They don't want to hear that. Yeah, exactly. Like in the replicator, we can make a sparkling wine that tastes just like champagne at this point. But yeah, you're right. The world has been full of decades of people, scientists, largely researchers, publishing. I've done it. I have unveiled the secret of the Stradivarius. And I grew up reading these stories, and I did kind of feel like it must be the equivalent of Greek fire, some lost technology that they had in Lombardy in the turn of the 18th century that somehow was lost, and we have been unable to duplicate.
You know what else has been lost? Kids growing up reading this stuff as entertainment.
Oh, yeah.
There's not going to be any Gen Z person that ever says, I grew up reading articles about people trying to scientifically examine the Stradivarius.
But I guess like that kind of pop science maybe will still appear in digital timelines.
Yeah, it'll be Neil deGrasse Tyson for 30 seconds.
Like somebody, I saw, it'll be kids being like, I saw a YouTube video about this.
Oh, that's right.
I'm kind of, or worse, I listened to Ken and John's podcast about this. Do you remember, speaking of which, like growing up, did you first hear of Stradivarius as a signifier for anything?
I read all those same articles. Absolutely. I was like, Stradivarius.
How are they going to?
Wow.
But
amazing.
But I also remember it kind of seeming like a treasure, like the same way your kids are interested in the Hope Diamond or the Crown Jewels, because I think there's maybe a Zork game where one of the treasures you're collecting is a Stradivarius. And that might have been the first time that I asked, hey, what's a Stradivarius? Oh, it's a very fancy violin.
I mean, I think reading those articles when I was 10 really influenced my feeling about guitars when I was 16. because the idea that there's magic in an instrument.
So even reading the violin articles affected you as a musician?
For sure, because I think a lot of the fetishization,
the fetishization?
What is it? Fetishization?
Fetishization
of guitars absolutely descends from the fetishization of violins and cellos.
Well, all the stuff you're talking about, the wood, is it the carving, is it something in the varnish? These are all absolutely key elements of every single Stradivarius headline of the last 100 years. People have been on a quest to figure out what it is in the makeup of the composition of this thing that is the secret sauce.
And varnish is bug poop of some kind, right? What is varnish?
Shellac is. But,
shellac.
But varnish can be different kinds of oils and resins. But I mean, the problem with doing a lot of these, right. I was going to say the other place I did hear very early about the mystique of Stradivarius is I think Sherlock Holmes's violin. So growing up reading Sherlock Holmes mysteries, I was like, oh, well, the violin that accompanies Holmes's Reveries is a Stradivarius. So
Reveries.
There was a sense that there was like a bigger world where the Stradivarius meant more than just a fancy concert violin. It was also a treasure.
And a sign of erudition.
Yes, exactly. It's a secret. The problem with doing a lot of this work on these violins is that you got to get a sample, and nobody wants you chipping up their Stradivarius for obvious reasons.
That's why we need Nicolas Cage involved.
But this has happened for hundreds of years, and gradually as the technology has gotten better, now there are, now you read about, well, for the first time we've done an X-ray now we've done a CT scan, we've done an MRI, we've done these advanced chemical tests on a sliver we got from the whatever. And like, I really did have the idea that there was just something like the accounts that you read of like what makes a Stradivarius special beyond just kind of this audiophile crap. Like you actually will hear people saying they defy the laws of physics. Like a violinist who has played a Stradivarius apparently, and the best have. It's like Perlman owns one, so does Joshua Bell.
Joshua Bell owns a Stradivarius?
Yeah, it's nice to be Joshua Bell, I guess.
It is. He's a local guy, we used to see him around all the time.
Was he carrying it?
No.
He didn't just...
I've never seen one.
He wasn't just holding it as he walked around town?
No, but he used to jump up with bands. I mean, that kid's cool.
Most people who play a Strat in concert, even the greats, do not own one. Like when Akiko Suwanai or like a cellist like Yo-Yo Ma or Rostropovich, when they play or played their Stradivarius, it was because some music institute, some university or whatever would lend them, and they'd be like, well, of course, Mr. Ma, you will always have access to your favorite Stradivarius cello anytime, sir.
That would really drive me crazy.
If you were just trying to use the lending library and Yo-Yo Ma's there trying to get his cello?
No, it just feels like, you don't want to borrow some museum's
No, it'd be awesome. Imagine if you were the kind of person who could walk up to the Smithsonian and be like, I'm going to need this ruby for this.
To wear on my bodice.
Exactly. And they'd be like, yes, sir. My Filson bag needs...
I guess the Queen of England has to borrow her crown from the...
Yeah, it's in the Tower of London.
The tower, yeah.
And she has to walk in and go on that little escalator thing and grab it from the case.
Yeah.
The alarm goes off and she's like, it's all right.
It's me.
I'm the Queen. I've been dead for several years and it really should be Charles in this story. But anyway, these theories about like how the... Oh, sorry. Did I say the thing about how it violates? No, I never finished the sentence.
Violates the physics.
Violinists will actually say that a Stradivarius will sound quieter to you under your chin. Like it'll sound quieter in the performer's ear and yet louder in the hall.
What?
Like it will violate the inverse square law of acoustics somehow.
Impossible.
And so this is the kind of mystery that people want to get to the bottom of. What is it about? And so as you and I think, grew up seeing, you will every 5 years, some scientist will announce that I've done it.
I've done it.
More or less, I have proven what it is that's so special about the Stradivarius, and the fact is none of them can agree.
We solved the Bermuda Triangle.
There's other areas of news that are like this, right? Where people are always just saying, I've done it, all the other answers are wrong, but my answer is right.
Yeah, my favorite is cold fusion. I'm still waiting for the next one.
But people always have a historical theory, and they manage to get the headlines by being like, everyone else is wrong, and I am right. Like a lot of the research does. I mean, it's unclear what it is about the instrument that would lead to that. Like, do you want a softer wood that leads to more cracks? Like, do you, as you say with a guitar, do you want it to ride under the bus and get more resonant over time? Is that why it's better? Because these are older?
But they were better in their time.
They were certainly described as such. And again, for 300 years, nobody's managed to announce an improvement on them.
You know, in audio, a lot of the equipment used to make albums had this same fetishization.
Like studio stuff?
Yeah, microphones that were made in East Germany and compressors that were made by hand by these guys in California. And then a lot of those companies, like Universal Audio especially, has done this incredible job of putting those machines through analysis and then perfectly duplicating them as software and then selling the software often for close to the price of the box.
So you press the button that gives you the filter that makes it sound like it came through that box or was recorded in that studio.
Yeah, and all the audio people, I mean, more and more, they're just like, yeah, it sounds just as good. I'm just putting it through the computer box.
Well, I prefer that, honestly, to people who are like, no, there's something
there still are those.
Science cannot measure. How dare you?
But
I'm not a big fan of science cannot measure.
Yeah, all that software is just ubiquitous now in all of the programs. And I mean, but here's the question, Ken. Does music sound as good as in the past?
Well, it's almost a one-hand clapping tree falls in the forest thing where you're like, well, what does the sound of music mean? The reaction of the listener? Because that could be affected by all kinds of psychic and emotional qualities that will not show up in a waveform. And if you think it sounds better, it does, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Rubber Band Man by the Spinners, you're not going to duplicate that just by having the right boxes.
Maybe you're not going to want to.
Oh,
no, that's mean. Should we go through some of the theories that have been thrown up over the years? This is what I love about Stradivarius coverage is like the outlandish, I have found it ideas. I think
the water of the Po River.
I mean, there is quite a bit of that. Like, it's got to be something local to Lombardy. And this, generally, it's described as being the wood. There must be something about the wood. Like you were talking about, they don't have these trees anymore. This theory gets even more attractive when you're dealing with the 17th or 18th centuries, because then we are in the middle of the Little Ice Age, which will probably be its own omnibus entry at some point.
And so the rings are closer together.
That is correct. Wood grain is actually different because the trees are growing more slowly in these cold environments, and therefore tighter rings, denser wood, and, you know, somehow he has access to maple and spruce that has this quality that we can't find anymore. Some say he had access to these Croatian maple stands.
Croatian maple stands?
That you and I...
I'm a stand for Croatian maple.
Not stands, but groves. You know what I'm saying, right? So there's all this theorizing of like, well, where did he get his wood? That's got to be it. The problem is that, again, when scrutinized by science, those claims don't really hold up. I mean, in general, like, it's true that wood back then was denser, but like, the grain density varies quite a bit in Stradivarius' own instruments. So when you actually measure the thing, it goes away. Like, this cannot be the secret sauce.
You are my density.
But he did have the wood is a very attractive hypothesis.
Yeah.
I was reading a Newsweek article, because that's the thing that's resonating. You know, that's the quality of the instrument is largely going to be the wood. And that was what he was innovating. You know, he had his technique was great as far as here's how you craft the wood. And I read a Newsweek article about a guy in Sioux City, Iowa, whose dad was in the war and therefore had this chunk of old wood from a monastery in Monte Cassino. And this guy was like, clearly the secret of Stradivarius' instruments was that he was using wood from old cathedral or castle beams or something.
Much older wood.
Exactly. So if we could just use such old... previously, what do you call it when wood is
kiln dried, aged?
Yeah, but rescued, like recovered.
Oh, salvaged.
Yeah, like if we could use salvaged wood.
Well, you know the famous story of Brian May's guitar.
No.
Brian May, the guitarist of Queen.
Is it made from a cathedral?
It's sort of like the baseball bat from The Natural, from a tree that was struck by lightning. But this was a piece of wood that was that was their mantelpiece. And he and his father took the mantelpiece off the fireplace and together made the iconic Brian May guitar.
And is he already Brian May at this point, or he's just a school kid doing this?
I think it was pre Queen, pre being famous.
Wow.
Maybe not, but it's got pickups and it's wired in certain ways that he can get the pickups out of phase, and it's got all this sort of innovation.
I have to say that doesn't have to do with it coming from a mantelpiece.
No,
the mantelpiece did not already have the exact pickups that Brian May wanted.
But Brian May has this very distinctive and famous guitar tone that everybody's always trying to duplicate, and it turns out, all you have to do is make a guitar with your dad out of your old mantle.
Some of the, even if he didn't get it from, there's no evidence that it came from cathedrals or castles. This is just a guy in Sioux City, Iowa being like, clearly this is how I'll make my Stradivarius, modern Stradivarius. It could be where on the tree he got it from. Like, what if he only got it from the south side of the tree that gets more of the sun?
Tripping balls now.
The problem is there's another guy announcing that I figured it out. He got the wood from the north face of mountain slopes that gets less sun. That's his secret.
There you go.
It can't be both.
Now, wait, does he cut the wood on a particular bias against the grain that no one else... is it just standard? He's just cutting the wood like he cut wood.
I mean, the problem with technique answers like that is that, again, nothing has changed in 300 years. Everybody fashioning the wood is doing it the same way today, and we'd be forced to say that they sound as good as a Stradivarius, and we don't want to say that.
Those carved-topped instruments, there's a kind of technique where you try and make the wood as thin as possible by carving out, as Michelangelo said, everything that's not the Stradivarius. I guess that would be measurable, and
he did do those things. I mean, we do see him experimenting with geometry and wood thickness, and people have tried to computer model the shape of a Stradivarius to see what is he doing here, because we know he did it with just a straight edge and a compass. Those are his tools. Yeah. So people trying to...
a knife of some kind.
Those are not his only tools. He had to cut down the tree with a straight edge and a compass?
Sure.
He's going all the way to Croatia with just a ruler?
Amazing. Now I'm even more impressed.
No, but to design the shape of it, he does not have access to CAD software and weird Bezier curves and stuff.
As far as we know, time is a flat circle.
Unless aliens. Is this a pyramids thing where the aliens came to Stradivarius and told him how to make a better violin? Yeah, you have to wonder why aliens would want a better violin. It doesn't seem like usually what they're interested in.
They're inscrutable.
I mean, I guess we did send them. Carl Sagan did send the aliens violin music.
It might be that when they kidnap people, they're trying to scare them, and they're like, we can't fit cellos on this flying saucer, but we will get cool violins and like hink, 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 just to increase the tension.
We're going to put some things in your F-holes, and then we're going to play psycho violins while we're doing it. But the fact is that he did experiment with stuff like that. So, his violins do have kind of longer F-holes. I guess the arch, the little bump on the back of the violin used to be more pronounced, and he found that a flatter arch produced a sound he liked better. So, so there are innovations like that. But again, those have carried on in the industry. So those can't be the secret sauce. Well, obviously you might have to treat the wood if it has worms or fungi in it. So a lot of people have been looking in the wood to see what trace elements are left from whatever that process is. And, a delighted researcher will tell you, we've done it. We found calcium. We found magnesium. We found borax. Borax makes its return to the omnibus
sounds
here.
Amazing, borax.
And again, none of these findings are accompanied by, and we tested it compared to a borax-free violin, and that did turn out to be the change. Really, all they're saying is there's magnesium. But the headline will tell you, and that's why it sounds like a Stradivarius. It's magnesium.
It's the media.
Nobody's actually doing the work on what would change.
Are all of them made out of the same kind of wood?
I think in general, it's a little bit confusing because our names for the trees are not the European names. So if you read an American source, it'll say maple and spruce, and then you'll read a European source and it'll say sycamore and cedar or something else like that.
Why do they have to be so difficult?
Just pick a word.
Come on, Europeans.
But that happens all the time with animals and plants. You'll be like, I'm interested in birds. What's a flicker? And it'll be like, well, in Europe, it's these 3 species. In America, it's these 2 totally unrelated species. The Asian flicker is unrelated to either of them. That's just how biology be.
What's a washing bear?
No, there's only one of those. It's clear that, you may want to do something to the wood before you varnish it, like to smooth it or to fill in cracks and crevices.
Like spit on it?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're filling it with something. I remember when I was a kid, I think the story that stuck in my head was volcanic ash.
Oh, from Pompeii.
I must have seen some like volcanic ash discovered in, that was the filler that his workshop must have used before the varnish. And so that was always the MacGuffin. But the varnish itself, I think, is where a lot of the research goes, because that could be anything,
right.
There's a secret ingredient, like a recipe, like somebody trying to duplicate grandma's steak sauce.
Yeah.
What is the thing he put in? Was it eggs?
Chewing tobacco.
Was it honey? Was it fossilized amber? These are all things that people are trying chemical tests for. Like if I could just find egg white in this varnish, we would know the secret of the Stradivarius sound.
It's Mama's carbonara.
That's what are the odds?
Hey.
And it was just spilled accidentally. He was just a messy eater, and he kept dropping meatballs onto the violin.
It's a spicy meatball.
Francesco, omobono. Don't eat the meatballs into my shop. In fact, there's a guy at Texas A&M who seems to have devoted his life to putting weird things in violin varnish to see what happens.
I feel like of all the things that people from Texas A&M can devote their lives to, that's one of the most benign.
Exactly.
Because those people are up to no good.
I feel like they should all stick to that, in fact. And that means he's making violin varnish with shrimp shells in it. Shrimp. He's making violin varnish with feces.
Ugh.
You thought this was going to... He's at Texas A&M.
See?
They think dung is the answer to everything.
Freaking Aggies.
And again, you'll see the results of these posted in technical journals. Like, we've done it. It's borax, with no actual evidence that it affects the tone in any way. They're limited to this one had borax. This one sample had some borax.
We've done it. We've kept one Aggie from joining Raytheon.
But what you want here, I think, is to answer the question, like, how would these things affect the sound? And that work has been done. And I think this is what's most interesting, because despite a lifetime of people trying to find the secret of Stradivarius, once you try to answer the question, not why do they sound different, but once you start with, do they sound different?
Do they sound different?
This is where the results are a little disappointing.
Oh, interesting.
If you're somebody like me who grew up with the volcanic ash and the Little Ice Age headlines.
Go on.
Back to 1817, people have done A/B testing, Pepsi Challenge testing of Stradivarius versus non-Stradivarius.
Blind tests where people sit in a chair with their backs to the violinist.
Well, often it's blind, including to the violinist.
Oh.
So these, there's record of these going back 200 years, 1817, and but the most rigorous ones that really started to get headlines happened in 2014. I think 10 elite violinists are at some kind of music conservatory or conference in Paris, and they are asked to. The violins have been disguised in such a way that you can't tell by anything about holding it.
Right.
That it's a Stradivarius. You are wearing welding goggles.
Whoa.
Something you rarely see.
Right.
I'm imagining it like Luke Skywalker trying out the lightsaber for the first time. So they're wearing, and they've even put like perfume on
so you can't smell
so you can't smell the old-timey violin taste. And then they tell these great violinists.
Do they tell them to control their anger?
Yeah. Good against the living. That's another. They tell these violinists they're going to be testing 20 different instruments, some old and some new. I think and kind of doing one against the other in the manner of an optometrist or an optician saying better or worse, better or worse. Yeah. What they're really doing, I think there's a smaller number of violins, but they're trying different combinations of these 6 violins. That's what they're told after the test. And then they're not asked. I think they're not asked, can you tell the Stradivarius? That would be an interesting thing to ask a violinist.
Right.
But they are asked, which did you prefer? And it turns out that the data pretty strongly suggests that the violinists prefer the modern violins.
Interesting.
Over the possibly 8-figure Stradivarius. once you welding goggle and perfume away the mystique of it. Now, it's easy to say, well, what does the audience think? And so the same researchers did a subsequent test in New York City, this time with audiences, and the double-blind audience also preferred the new violin.
Because probably louder, clearer.
Well, in violation of all this mystique of like this unusual performance of the sound in a concert hall that no other violin maker could match, it actually turns out, to the degree there is a difference, and who knows, people prefer the new violin, which is basically Stradivarius tech plus any standardization or innovation over the last 300 years. And so, I mean, and let's be honest, they're not just using average violins. Like the A/B test is with a very nice, probably 5-figure modern violin. So when these violinists are like, I like this high-end instrument, it's a good one.
And presumably the audiences are also refined audiences that are not just like people off the streets who are like, that one sounds louder.
Yeah, I think it's people who like classical music and would call themselves appreciators of subtleties of violin playing. So all those years of we did it, it's egg whites and the varnish or whatever, all that appears to be based on the faulty premise that a Stradivarius does sound better. I think after this study came out, and this made a lot of headlines, like, they're not actually better. The columnist Gene Weingarten actually, I think, took Joshua Bell into like a DC metro station and just had him play a Stradivarius. Like
Did he get more tips?
For commuters, yeah, and just to see what would happen. And 1,000 people just walk by a guy playing a Stradivarius. He makes $32 over 45 minutes, which is not bad.
Sure, no, that's pretty good.
But that's, to whatever degree there is a magical secret of the Stradivarius sound, it is easy to disregard for the layperson hurrying to work.
Yeah,
and I think that was kind of his point, that if you're hoping for some siren song that will make even a layperson say,
stop you in your tracks.
What am I hearing? That's not like any violin I've ever heard. There is no such effect. So it seems like the answer might just be, and this is a little boring, but this is, I guess, if you have a kid learning the violin, the answer is consistency. Stradivarius started making violins at a time when there were a ton of crappy violins out there, right? There were good workshops, bad workshops, and different workshops. And he was actually a good craftsman and a keen mind who, maybe a Henry Ford type, who kind of sought to standardize things such that his little loft could produce 1,100 very good violins, to the degree that somebody like a Medici or King James or a local concert goer would say, I've heard a lot of violins, and boy, you get a lot of weird sounds, but this guy has the stuff.
Yeah. Right. And who knows about fashion, right? I'm sure that the necks and the fingerboards, which have almost certainly been studied exhaustively, I'm sure that at the time they had, because you pick up a violin, there are 3 or 4 different things you're going to experience right away. Like, how does the neck feel? How does it sit against my chin?
What's the size?
I'm going to play one note. How's it sound? And you can fall in love with an instrument in 30 seconds. It happens all the time. You pick up a guitar at the guitar store, you play 2 unamplified chords, and you're like, this is a great guitar. You haven't done anything with it, but the way it feels and fits
in general,
in your hand.
do you turn out to be right? Like, does that turn out to be a guitar where the appeal lasts?
Yeah, but it's personal too. There are people that are like, I like a fat-necked guitar. And then other people are like, that's body shaming.
Well, I wonder if, the thing that has gone unsaid here is that the Stradivarius effect might be a self-perpetuating, because everybody's aware of the mystique of, if you're a performer playing and if you're an audience listening to this storied violin. So you're going to tell yourself you're hearing something that maybe you're not.
Yeah.
And in fact, if the performer is so inspired that they play better.
Yeah, sure.
Like, then a Stradivarius does sound better. If its mystique makes the performer sound better. And there's probably an analogous effect with guitars where, you're going to play differently on a guitar you really are kind of in awe of for whatever historical or craftsmanship reason.
Absolutely. When Jason Isbell stands up there with Red Eye and plays Smoke on the Water, it sounds incredible.
But when I but when I steal his guitar,
Yeah.
I get taken to jail.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not fair.
Boo. And that concludes Stradivarius Violins, entry 1231.PS9203, certificate number 36611 in the omnibus. Futurelings, social media died an inglorious death.
R.I.P. social media.
But it still exists in your era.
Maybe. If it,
Oh,
if
no,
it,
no,
if
no.
it
I'm
comes
sorry.
back.
Right. No. Futurelings. It's hopefully not going to have anything to do with your era. You're going to remember it as a dark time. It's going to be like phrenology. You're going to think, oh, do you remember back in the early part of the 21st century when people thought that everybody should have an opinion expressed at all times about all things?
Don't you hate listening to an 1890s podcast and they're always plugging phrenology at the end of every
They're
show?
just like, look at the lumps on a person's head. You can tell how smart they are.
That's why podcasting didn't catch on back then. You couldn't see the lumps of your parasocial friend.
That's right. And the thing is,
I don't know if his ideas are good. I can't see his lumps.
it may be that 10 years from now, instead of everyone having a podcast, maybe no one will have a podcast.
Because they'll be banned by law.
I think likely. And then there will be like a renegade group of a ragtag soldiers who are like, we still listen to podcasts.
It's going to be a Mad Max-like wasteland where people are driving these car convoys between the studio that makes the podcasts.
Yes.
And then you've got to take the podcasts down to the ad studio where you record the ads. And then you've got to drive it over to the Citadel where everybody listens to your podcast.
Well, it may just be that podcasts are listened to only by the weird family of mutants that live at the top of the Citadel, and that's how they know how to control all the people.
Isn't that kind of true society today? The podcasts are only listened to by the weird group of mutants at the top of the tech Citadel?
Pretty sure you're right. Pretty sure you're not wrong.
Well, that's certainly what's going to happen then.
I keep being stunned by the number of people who are introducing new podcasts right now. I'm like, wow, a new podcast? Wow.
Do you think podcasts are like a Stradivarius and that for 300 years, they'll all just sound like This American Life?
Well, people are really trying to figure out what's the right combo for sure. They're like, well, my podcast has interviews, but also I just sit and talk for a long time, but also I have a co-host, but also...
I mean, podcasting is almost less like Stradivarius and more like the Monkees with the typewriters. At this
I thought
point,
you meant the band at first. I was like, it is kind of like...
it's like the Monkees. Yeah, a bunch of people who can't do the thing are being asked to do the thing because they look good. Jason Bateman. No,
what do you
I'm just
think
kidding.
the next like hit podcast that hasn't come out yet is going to be about? Like it's going to be some... I mean, if we knew, we'd do it, right?
Yeah.
Actually, it's us.
I mean, it can't be anything. It can't be anything adjacent to anything that's already been a hit. It won't be true crime.
Yeah.
It won't just be like Obama has a podcast.
All the future slugs who are listening and are saying, it's you, Bill and Ted. You're the ones who became the architects of the future.
Thank you. We accept that mantle.
Anyway, what you should do right now is email us at theomnibusproject@gmail.com and tell us all about the modeling of whatever crazy thing it is that you're into and how successful or unsuccessful it is. You should, as usual, send me all the interesting patches that your grandparents collected from Eastern Europe and Central America and the Caribbean, and send me those patches to P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington, 98155. And you should send Ken, what do you even like? Coffee table books? It's too expensive.
Mixed nuts?
Send Ken mixed nuts, but make sure that you didn't mix them yourself in a garbage bag.
Yeah,
Make them in sealed containers.
That's the main thing I'm always telling my employees. Hey, guys, stop mixing these nuts.
Did I not tell you
in a
this?
garbage?
I went on Amazon and I was like, I loved mixed nuts.
And you cannot lie.
And I'm looking at stuff and it's like, oh, those mixed nuts are expensive. Those are expensive. And then there was a site that was, an Amazon seller that said 5-pound bag of mixed nuts. And I was like, I'll buy it. And I bought it and it came in a garbage bag. They had, wherever they're located, they are there mixing nuts. And it's a 5-pound bag, that's a lot of nuts. I'm still eating my way through this 5-pound bag of of nuts and banana
Have you
chips.
considered just getting a Costco card? If you want a large amount of mixed nuts weirdly cheap.
You know what's messed up is I have a Costco card.
Also, you live like 15 minutes from a Costco. Just go get off Amazon.
Yeah, I'm a Costco stan too.
Oh, we love Costco here. I will accept no Costco slurs.
If you have a bunch of mixed nuts, 55744 Shoreline, Washington 98155. But what you can really do to support the show and enable us to go to Costco and buy our own mixed nuts is to go to patreon.com/omnibus project and sign up to become a supporter of the show. In fact, Ken and I are about to record, right as soon as we're done here, we're going to record an addenda show, of which there are now more than 70, right?
That is not true, but
There are more than 40.
correct.
There are more than 40. Are there 50? There are more than 50.
There's 50-something.
50-something of them, which is...
That's crazy because it means we've been doing it almost 5 years.
Yeah. Well, and you could listen to an addenda a week for an entire year. That's a bounty. That's how great a bounty it is.
What just an embarrassment of riches.
And other stuff there. The Patreon has such a wonderful selection of content. You'll never get tired of it. So let me just say that again, patreon.com/omnibus project.
Do yourself a favor. Listeners, from our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear may never come. But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may be our final word. We hope that's not true. We hope that Providence will allow us to be back with you soon for yet another entry in the Omnibus.